The situation as of today. In my announcement, I talked about the issue of whether or not the banks are likely to collapse. As you go around YouTube and BitChute and Brighteon and all kinds of places, you see people, doom and gloomers, telling you that the bank system is going to collapse and take all your money with it. So what do I think about that? Probably not. If you think about it, we've been through a number of crises in the last couple of years. Brexit, the repo crisis, crypto bouncing around, and the Evergrande crisis in China. And of course, the mother of all crises went back to 2008 with the collapse of real estate. None of those things brought down the bank system, and perhaps several of them tested it, and it was found to be strong enough. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because of something called regulatory capital. You probably haven't heard of this because this is something that goes on deep inside banks. And there are only a few people involved in this, so almost nobody knows about this unless they've had the opportunity to work on this particular issue. The main thing about regulatory capital is that banks are required to risk rate every asset they have, whether it's cash, accounts receivable, real estate loans, personal loans, commercial loans, derivatives, all manner of things. But they are required to assess the risk of these things going into default. And there are some calculations that they make in order to do this. The basic calculations have to do with probability of default, which is basically the percentage of instruments of a particular type that do go into default, and then there is the loss given default, which is the amount of money they typically lose on any particular asset class when it does go into default. And there is a little bit of mathematics involved with this. And when we talk about the probability of default, let's say that you have an asset worth $10 and there's a 10% chance that it will go into default. This means that you have $1 at risk. And then if that instrument goes belly up, what happens? Well, then you go to the loss given default, and a bank may know based on its history or averages that if they lose $1 in a broken instrument, they're probably going to lose 20% of that as a result of being unable to recapture any value from it. So now they've got 20 cents at risk. Every asset that a bank has is then put through a risk rating process, and every type of instrument has its own risk rating level. For example, commercial loans have a risk premium of 100%, which means that if you have a potential loss of 20 cents, the bank has to keep 20 cents in reserve. At the top of the risk pyramid, we find derivatives, which can be, for example, bundles of mortgages. Because of what happened in 2008, the rules were changed, and now these derivatives have to go to something called a clearinghouse, which kind of takes custody of them. A big part of the problem in 2008 was that there had not been a market for all of the derivatives that were being created and rated. And so you would have maybe a derivative with $1 billion in mortgages. A rating agency may have given that a AAA rating, and since it wasn't challenged as far as the world knew, it really was worth $1 billion. Now, what happened in 2007 basically was that the guy behind what came to be known as the Big Short started looking under the surface of some of these things, and then he did some traveling to places like Florida, and what he found was that some of these supposedly AAA instruments were filled with garbage, and they could not possibly be worth the stated value. Okay, so that's how he made a huge pile of money, by using that knowledge and betting against derivatives and ultimately making a lot of money. But in the clearinghouses, there is a market, and the market value changes day by day, and the banks are required to settle any changes in cash. on a daily basis. If it goes up, they get cash. Maybe if it goes down, they pay cash. So this way, the real value of the derivatives is tracked. In addition to this kind of protection for risk, banks and other sophisticated investors will also do hedging to reduce their risk. And what this means is that, let's say, if they buy some stock in the expectation that it will go up, there's always a risk that it will go down. And what they will do in that case is that they will go into the options market and buy something called a put, which is basically a bet that the price will go down. So the end result of these hedging operations can be that if the market moves against them, the value of the put would increase to such an extent that they would break even on the investment. The last piece of the puzzle is something called a haircut. If you look back to the 2008 timeframe, you can see that there was a lot of bitterness on the part of the public about the banks going to Congress for money and getting about $700 billion in bailouts. Since then, they have put in a rule which says that if there is a problem, the bank must first pay for the problem to the full extent of its capital before they come to the government for assistance. And this, of course, puts a lot of pressure on people to manage well because they do not want to see their shareholders' equity going to zero. At the end of the last meeting, one of the people asked who would survive a collapse of our high-tech society. And this picture basically shows you the answer. The people who would survive are the people who are currently living off the land. And there are large parts of South America and Africa where this is still the case. Almost all of us in the high-tech advanced civilizations would probably die of thirst and hunger and cold and disease fairly quickly if the whole thing went belly up. So, we all have an interest in keeping this thing going. My forecast is that what will happen to our civilization or to our empire is that there will be shrinkage but not collapse. If you think back to prior centuries, France, Britain, Germany, Netherlands, Spain had empires, and those empires collapsed, but those countries are still there, and their currencies are still there, and that is the likely fate that we will have. It will be very uncomfortable on the way down, but the likelihood is that something will be left to build again. What's happening in my garden? Well, at the current time, the moon is at 66.6%, 666, waxing gibbous phase, and this means that it's a good time to plant above ground crops. Here's an above ground crop that I planted 3 months ago. It's a romaine plant, and I've been harvesting leaves from it for 2 months now. It looks like it will keep going for a while, making nice, big, delicious leaves. Here's a fig tree that I bought a month or 2 ago. It was looking pretty sad when I got it, but I've been feeding it my full spectrum plant food, and it's making nice leaves. In a few months, I'll probably put it outside in a bigger pot, and we'll see what happens. One reason I got a fig is that they will supposedly produce fruit the first year that you plant them, so I really hope that's the case. It may only be a few fruits, but that would be a tasty delight to have anyway. And here's the current state of my floating Kratky system. These plants are about 45 days old. I am harvesting leaves from these and will continue to do so. As far as the romaine lettuce is concerned, I think some of it is a little bit too crowded. And in my new plantings, I'm putting in 3-4 seeds of romaine, and we'll trim it back possibly to only one plant. But in the meantime, these are growing, and I do cut leaves off and make salads and omelets out of them. Floating gardens are not a new thing. At least by the year 1300, the Aztecs in Mexico had very substantial floating gardens. They were built in the area of Mexico City, and there was a town called Tenochtitlan or something like that, about 200,000 people, And those people were being largely fed from all the floating gardens built in the swamps around the city. And those gardens were producing 7 crops a year. And that's a testament to the power of hydroponics, which is that given a steady supply of water and nutrients, plants will grow faster. About 2 weeks ago, I planted a couple of pots of beets. I'm mainly interested in greens, and one reason for that is that I am still harvesting leaves from the radish plants that I planted, a month or 6 weeks ago. And, it seems to be that they will continue growing, and it really feels like if you just to grow a radish for 30 days and harvest it and throw it away, you get the radish, but you also throw away a lot of food value. So if you're going to do radishes in your garden, you might want to do some just for greens because it is a very nutritious green. Other solutions. Back in the 1600s, at the periphery of Paris, people were growing food crops in what they called fruit walls, which were basically just brick walls surrounding small areas in which they grew plants. And the reason for this is that those brick walls would absorb heat during the day and slowly release it, which had the effect of extending the day's warmth. As far as the benefits are concerned, for people who grew peaches, they noticed that their peaches ripened sooner, went to market sooner, and sold at a higher price. Keep in mind that this was in the 1600s, and that is important because of this chart of the grand solar minimum. You may notice here that between 1600 and 1700, the world experienced something called the Maunder minimum, which was a period of low solar activity and low temperatures, which caused a lot of problems with the crops. But these fruit walls were a significant solution to the problem of the weather at that time. In the town of Tamery, France, you can still see these fruit walls. They are all these lines running across the picture diagonally. And what you see here is that these fruit walls were oriented a little bit towards the southeast. So this meant that they caught the morning sunlight and continued to grab heat during the day. Here is another example of a fruit wall, this time in the British Empire in Scotland. When you look up fruit walls, you do see pictures from England. You see straight walls, you see serpentine walls, you see walls that are glass covered, all kinds of things. And here's an example of a greenhouse built up against a fruit wall. And you see that it has side and front walls, also made of stone. And this means that a big part of this structure absorbs heat during the day for use during the night, and thus extends the growing season. Now you could go one step further by putting insulation on the outside of these walls, and that would store even more heat and retain it longer. And this is something that we may need to discover as time goes on in the current Maunder minimum or solar minimum. And here from my own yard is a little example of how this might work. Along the north side of this yard there is a concrete wall about 18 inches tall. And a few years ago I did notice that flowers planted close to this wall did grow faster and did bloom faster than ones on other walls. And that's because this concrete was absorbing and holding heat during the day. A few days ago, I was cruising the web and I came across a website that was offering survival food buckets for $89. And this was intended to feed one person for 1 week. Something that bears on this is a 50-year-old book called Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lappé. And the main point of this book is that by buying the right kind of components, such as beans and rice, you can combine plant foods in order to give yourself all of the essential amino acids that you need to be well nourished. But it is a fact that you still need animal protein. You cannot be a vegan and be healthy. That's because your body needs something called heme iron, which is quite literally iron that has been passed through the blood of an animal and is therefore more absorbable. So let's go back to the $89 bucket and think about, well, what if we buy components instead of a bucket for $89? Black beans cost maybe $3 a pound. Rice, corn, wheat, and other grains about $1 a pound. Eggs are still less than $2 a dozen. Chicken less than $2.50 a pound. What this means is that by making some of these vegetarian dishes and adding an egg or a little piece of chicken to it, you can get yourself a very healthy meal for a lot less money than you can by buying all this survival food. Here is the list of alternative sources of information, and I want to point out two new entries at the bottom. One is for Low Tech Magazine, which was the source of the old picture for the fruit walls in France, and then No Tech Magazine was the source for the Scottish example. So they deal with a lot of things in these magazines or websites. The thing to keep in mind is that the stuff that makes us powerful is also the stuff that makes us vulnerable, which is our high technology. And one way that we can make ourselves and our families and our communities less vulnerable is by reducing our dependence on technology.